If you're into RTS games like me, then chances are you've at least heard of World in Conflict. If not explicitly mentioned as a really good RTS game, then in passing when talking about new RTS games that strike a similar chord. Most people who talk about World in Conflict only seem to talk about it positively. But if it was so good, how come it isn't as popular as the likes of StarCraft and Company of Heroes? Why is that? Well, I'm so glad that you asked. In the mid-2000s, RTS games were still one of the biggest genres in gaming. This was long before the steep drop in popularity the genre had, which relegated it to a mostly niche category. But things weren't looking too hot even then. The genre was starting to get a bit stagnant. But there was one dev team that thought they could push it along. Meet Massive Entertainment. They came up with the ingenious idea of blending together the class roles and killstreak features of the booming first-person shooters of the time, and the general RTS experience. The result was World in Conflict, a fast-paced, tightly focused, and intense RTS game set in an alternate Cold War scenario. The game would launch with an excellent single-player campaign as well as a well-liked multiplayer mode. I never did get a chance to play the multiplayer, but everything I've heard about it has been good. Now this could be nostalgia speaking, but I don't think so. The gameplay mechanics are well crafted and plays very well in single player. I can see it translating very well into multiplayer. The game was so well liked it even got itself an expansion pack, Soviet Assault, which adds in a bunch of new levels for the campaign, telling the story from the Soviet perspective. It's a great expansion and integrates impressively into the single player, but that doesn't mean its development was without hiccups. Soviet Assault was in the middle of its development when Activision merged with the game's publisher at the time, Vivendi. Vivendi came with a lot of fat that Activision didn't want, so they whipped out the hacksaw and started cutting away at a bunch of studios and games. Massive Entertainment and World in Conflict got caught up in this, so development of the expansion got cut for a bit until Ubisoft bought out Massive from Activision. Due to this interruption, Massive had to dial down their plans for the single-player expansion to just being a series of new missions interspersed across the original campaign. They also had to cancel a potential console release entirely. That being said, Soviet Assault only enhances the experience of the game and takes nothing away. Visually, the game is definitely a bit on the dated side by today's standards, but I don't think it's too far off from the standards of the year it was released. The different models, where all the different tanks, infantry, helicopters, and all that jazz have aged relatively well. I didn't expect to see even individual grunts to be modeled so well down to the equipment. These are details that you'd expect from a first-person shooter of the time, not from an RTS. So this is pretty good. I will say though, the textures do look pretty muddy by this point. That being said, this is an RTS game. You aren't going to be zooming in up close most of the time you're playing, and if you are, it's a conscious decision you're making. The few times that you're really up close and personal to the in-game models is in the cutscenes that happen in between levels or during major developments. These aren't all too common, they happen either in the beginning or at the end of the level. But your eyes will take a little bit of adjustment if you're used to modern graphical fidelity. Given its rarity and brevity, I feel like I can let the aging texture work slide. There are games that have aged far worse when it comes to visual quality after all. Something that actually surprised me when I replayed the game for my review was the amount of visual variety that comes to the maps. I mean, sure, a lot of the maps are built with similar assets. A sizable chunk of the game is set in the Pacific Northwest, so most of the design and architecture are mostly going to be late 80s to early 90s suburbia or small town America. But the lighting changes the mood entirely. The weather and skybox really sets the tone for each mission, and it helps set apart what would otherwise be a blur of battles in similar looking locations. Like this mission here where you're trying to escort civilians out of the suburbs. The sun is setting, the sky is turning red, the mood is grim and desperate as the Soviets push you out of Seattle. Then there's this mission in a small coastal town where you're waiting for Allied reinforcements. It's dark and cloudy, but there's a flicker of sunshine piercing through the clouds. Again, it really helps set the missions apart from each other, and I really appreciate it. The sound and visual effects, on the other hand, hold up spectacularly well. Explosions are loud, crackling, and bassy. You see the shockwaves rippling around the blast for a split second with the flashes of the explosions. Muzzle flashes burst for a split second and is accompanied by equally impressive booms as the shell leaves the barrel with a trail behind it. Dust gets kicked up with every shell being fired. Everything from cannon shots to assault rifles sound good and is distinct. The explosions especially are great. It's superb, and I honestly think it outshines some explosion effects we're getting today. If not in terms of quality, then in terms of how it's presented, because the carnage that these explosions create is honestly stellar. World in Conflict has some of the best effects of the time, and honestly, it still holds up today. The destruction in this game also deserves a shout out. It's not very common that games let you level an entire city casually. So if you've always wanted to make the Seattle homeless problem even worse, here's your chance. Blow up those homes, drop a bomb on them, the whole 9 yards. The amount of buildings you can destroy here is impressive, but sadly the terrain deformation leaves a bit to be desired. The most you get are blast textures on the ground where shells land. These interact with the lighting, but they're just textures. Terrain deformation would have taken World in Conflict's spectacular explosions into a whole other level, but the game's still good without it. Things kind of fall apart when it comes to the game's music though. While the tracks themselves get pretty good, they're severely underutilized. The game uses the soundtrack so sparingly I didn't really get the chance to have the background music sink in. It's a shame because I honestly believe a good soundtrack can elevate what is otherwise a generic experience to a good one. Though that's not to say that World in Conflict is your run-of-the-mill RTS game though. No, this game is built different. Well, from that, you could be asking what makes World in Conflict so different from RTS games of the time. Well, it has to do with the gameplay, obviously. I mean, sure, the basics are pretty similar to the rest of the genre. You control a group of units, you have to deal with positioning, formations, etc, etc. But it's different in that there's no base building, no resource management mechanic, no tech tree research, none of that. You're a field commander, not a logistician or a bureaucratic desk jockey. Your job is to tell your men who to shoot and make sure they come home waving their flags as opposed to being wrapped in them. You're not managing builders that demand more lumber to build a new armory so that you can build a new type of wagon. There's no need to think about where resources need to be gathered or what kind of upgrades you need to research. There are only two things you really need to manage in World of Conflict: your units and your support points. It's a fairly simple system and is very easy to get used to once you figure out how it works. Unlike the average strategy game, World in Conflict doesn't have you build units. Instead, you request them by mail. You have a fixed pool of what is basically cash, and this is what you use to buy new units. You open the menu and with your budget, you pick out the units you want for the mission. Each unit has its own weaknesses, strengths, and uses, so figuring out what's good for the situation at hand is going to be essential. I mean, you could load up on a full squad of M1 tanks, but tanks can't hide in the forest like army rangers can. But at the same time, those same army rangers could get wiped by a well-placed sniper or MG nest. There's a lot of possibilities when it comes to unit composition, and different deployment builds means tackling objectives differently. It's a lot of fun to figure out. Once you've got your units picked out on your shopping cart, you place a marker down on an approved delivery zone and Amazon Prime will deliver your army straight to you within 20 seconds. Be careful with your units though. The budget you have is the budget you get. Once you've spent it, it's gone. I mean, sure, sometimes completing objectives gains you extra requisition points, but these are occasions and not the norm. The only way you're getting your requisition points back is if you lose a unit. And even then, the refund will trickle in as opposed to come all at once. So, if you lose a unit, it'll be a while before you can call in a replacement, and that could mean your positions get overrun and having to reload a save. Again, half the fun is figuring out which units work. The other half is getting your units to blow up the enemy before the enemy blows yours up. The fire support system is also an interesting add. In most other RTS games, you have to build your own artillery or bomber units for long-range support. In World in Conflict, you could command your own artillery units if you want, sure, but you don't necessarily have to if you want to bring down the thunder. Destroying enemy units grants you support points. Support points are spent on fire support requests like artillery strikes, air strikes, paratrooper drops, missile strikes, the whole catalog. Each have their own uses, perks, and drawbacks. Generally speaking, the more powerful they are, the more points you'll need to spend, but that doesn't mean they're automatically more useful for the situation at hand. Sure, you could call in a B-52 bombing run to erase the enemy occupying the town, but you need to hold the town after taking it, and that bombing run is going to wipe out all the cover you could have used against an enemy counterattack. A laser-guided bomb, on the other hand, is a lot more accurate than an artillery strike, but it'll cost you more and it arrives slower. Decisions, you'll have to figure it out. It's a great system that incentivizes tactical thinking while keeping combat running dynamically without having to bog you down with capturing resource nodes. This streamlined approach also carries to gameplay itself. Each unit is only going to have 2 abilities, max, and it's very easy to remember which units have which ability, even across different factions. Combat is also more on the arcade side than the realistic side. It's not as realistic as something like Company of Heroes or Men of War Assault Squad. The game nicely balances streamlined gameplay and complexity. I think the system works pretty well. Another thing I want to bring up is that the AI for the individual units are actually pretty competent. You're not going to have to be a micromanaging deity to have fun in this game. Units will mostly move intelligently and can engage enemies independently. The few times I do notice the AI shitting the bed is because a literal horde of enemies starts overwhelming them and they get confused with which one to shoot first. This doesn't happen very often and can be mitigated by positioning your troops better. So there's never a point where you have to channel your inner Korean StarCraft player. Overall, the gameplay will be the one carrying the experience, and it does a damn good job at it. The mechanics are simple to learn but can also be challenging to master. That it's so accessible yet also distinguishable from its contemporaries is a huge win on my book. The one major gripe I do have with gameplay is that sometimes the terrain isn't defined enough to tell you whether or not your unit has a line of sight with the enemy. There's a couple of times where I thought my tanks could shoot over the bit of elevation between them and the enemy, only to have my boys crest the hill and right into an enemy formation. It can get frustrating, but once you figure out, it's pretty easy to work around. It's a shame that not many new RTS games choose to build up on what World in Conflict did. With Ubisoft now calling the shots for massive entertainment, I sincerely doubt would ever get a sequel. Now let's talk about the campaign. The game is set in an alternate history version of the Cold War, where instead of self-imploding circa 1990s, the Soviets attempt one last-ditch effort to get over the capitalist Schwein in 1989. As a last Hail Mary move, the CCCP begins an assault across the Berlin Wall as well as a massive push across the Fulda Gap. Now, some of you might ask why neither side immediately responded with a nuclear exchange. Well, later in the campaign, it's explained that Reagan's Star Wars defense project has utterly convinced the Soviets that the Americans are impervious to nuclear strikes, so they decide not to waste any of their nuclear armament. But how come the Americans didn't launch a nuclear strike of their own? Surely a one-sided nuclear exchange to wipe the enemy clean would be preferable to a long, bloody ground war. Well, the answer to that lies in the spoiler territory, so I'll have to cover it later. In the American campaign, you play as Lieutenant Parker, a faceless and silent protagonist who only speaks in loading screens as he reminisces about the war. He's voiced by Big Iron Baldwin, and he delivers his narration with the gravitas of a war-worn veteran who's seen it all. It's a good performance and really adds to the game's narrative. Parker is saddled with hot-headed glory hound Captain Bannon and later on the easygoing but dependable Major Webb. They all serve under hard-ass Colonel Sawyer, who is tough as nails, tough to please, and isn't shy about telling you what he thinks of you. On the Soviet side then, you play as Lieutenant Romanov, a player character just as faceless and silent as Parker. Romanov also only speaks exclusively in loading screens, so neither he nor Parker get to make any of the big decisions. Romanov serves alongside Captain Malashenko, a true believer in the ways of socialism, and Major Lebedev, who toes the party line due to his father-in-law being an important politician. They all answer to stern but fair Colonel Orlovsky, who while respectful about it, couldn't give less of a shit what politicians at home thought and only cares about getting his men home alive. The campaign will take both sides from the fields of southern France to the icy mountains in Norway and northern Russia, then all the way to the Pacific Northwest in Washington state. Despite basically seeing action in the same theaters of war, the American and Soviet characters never actually face off against each other. It's implied that Malashenko was a part of the final battle in Seattle, but that bit of information is left as uncertain. The reason that these characters never directly interact with each other is because none of the Soviet characters even existed before the expansions was made, not even as side characters you hear about over radio. So even though the Soviet levels are played in between the American ones, there's very little interaction between the two. What's really disappointing though is that what cross-interaction exists really adds to the story. A mistake that Bannon made in Europe heavily affects Maloshenko as a character, and a pivotal decision made by Colonel Sawyer midway through the campaign causes Colonel Orlovsky to lose hope in the war. Again, it's a letdown that there isn't more interaction, but given the circumstances, it's fine as it is. My last major gripe with the story is that it's told out of chronological order. Because of this, some character arcs get reset midway through the game because of the flashback levels. We essentially join a character midway through his development, then go through all the way to the end, then we jump back all the way to the start where he's still insufferable. It kind of takes away from the growth that we've seen him go through, and I honestly think the story would flow a lot better if it was presented in chronological order. Further discussion is going to have to wade into spoiler territory, so if you're already sold on the game, skip over to this timestamp because I am going to be diving headfirst into spoilers from here on out. The writing in this game is surprisingly good, so I do recommend picking up the game without knowing much more of the story. Otherwise, you have been warned. Are they gone? Alright. With the expansion installed, the story starts with the Soviets gearing up for war. Orders are given, officers are giving briefings, the whole 9 yards. Loading screens are hidden behind the still images, usually accompanied by voiceover that pushes the plot forward. Sometimes it's narration by Parker or Romanov, sometimes it's conversation between two different characters discussing how the war is going. It's a neat way to explore other aspects of the war not directly covered by the game proper. Players finally are given control of Romanov when he is informed of the upcoming assault. His team of Spetsnaz commandos are rerouted to infiltrate a NATO base camp in preparation for the assault that is coming in a few hours. It's an easy level that explains the very basics of the game mechanics like movement, targeting, unit abilities, the whole works. If you've already played the tutorial, this is a bit redundant, but it's a quick and mostly non-intrusive refresher, so it doesn't really hurt. The war begins proper when the Soviets begin the operation to liberate West Berlin. The Berlin Wall is blown by Soviet engineers and Romanov is now part of the spearhead. The mission further expands on the tutorial aspect of the previous Spetsnaz op, and it really helps you get a feel for the game. You get acquainted with optional objectives that you don't have to do, but completing them tends to make missions easier, so if you think it's worth the risk, then you should probably do it. The mission then caps off with a bombastic finale as the Americans throw one final effort to try and break the Soviet push. Obviously, it doesn't work, otherwise the game ends here. After a quick cutscene where the Soviet characters celebrate, we get a time skip of 4 months. If you didn't have Soviet Assault installed, this is where the game actually starts. The commies snuck past the US Pacific Fleet in civilian cargo ships like the rats they are. We're then introduced to Bannon, who proceeds to be a dick to almost everyone throughout the entire level. From almost abandoning allies to claiming credits for victories that you did. At the very least, he is trying to coordinate the US forces still in Seattle, so he's not entirely a bag of dicks. There seems to be some history between Parker and Bannon seems to resent you and your so far unnamed colonel for said history. Further on into the story, it's alluded that Bannon screwed up really badly while he was in Europe. It's properly explained later, but for now we're left guessing. So you take control of Parker and run around putting fires out across the city by saving everyone, from civvies to stranded National Guard. If they're on the map, you probably did them a favor somehow. You almost single-handedly turned the tide in their faction's favor. You should get used to this, it's going to happen a lot. On both sides, no less. After evacuating Seattle, the American campaign becomes a series of delaying battles to slow down the Soviet offensive. It's a desperate fight. The US forces were caught with their pants down. This is the first time a foreign power has invaded the American mainland since the Canadians burned down the White House back in 1812. Everyone's in shock, even the Soviets. In between these battles, we meet Major Webb and Colonel Sawyer. Webb's personality is a bit bland, but he's dependable in a fight. He reminds me a bit of Jacob from Mass Effect in that his character doesn't really go anywhere. But Jacob is actually badly written, whereas Webb just doesn't get much writing. Sawyer, on the other hand, leaves a strong impression. He's a tough son of a bitch to please, but when he congratulates you, you know you've earned it. Over to the Soviet side of the story, Romanov and his gang got sent down south to stop the enemy reinforcements. Maloshenko is starting to chafe under Orlovsky's command. He's chomping at the bit to kill Americans, but the colonel is holding him back. This whole thing blows up when the captain is caught organizing firing squads against American guerrillas, even when the colonel specifically told them not to. The captain's own men are hesitant to do it. It's becoming clear that Maloshenko is taking the war very personally, but for the moment it's not clear why. We then flip back to the American side, where the whole reason behind the Soviet invasion is revealed to the player. The commies are gunning after Fort Teller, which is supposed to be the headquarters for the Star Wars defense project. What they intend on doing with the project is unclear. What is clear is that once they get their hands on it, it's one step closer to global thermonuclear war. What the Soviets don't actually realize is that the whole program is one big trick. The whole project failed to materialize anything of use, but the Americans played it off as a total success. The only way to stop the world from burning in nuclear fire is to make sure the Soviets never get to Fort Teller. To these ends, Colonel Sawyer and the gang are deployed near a town called Cascade Falls, which is the last stop before Fort Teller. This small force is the only thing standing between the Soviets and Armageddon. So again, Parker is tasked with delaying the Soviets as long as possible. But there's too many commies and not enough bullets. They eventually get pushed back to the town itself and make one final stand. It is at this point that Colonel Sawyer reveals the bombshell. He has authorization to call a nuclear strike on the town if it seems like the Soviets are going to break through. Captain Bannon, by this point having come around and realizing what's at stake, does the ultimate choice.
Sir, if we all fall back at once, they'll understand that something's up. Someone needs to stay behind to lure them in.
He's right. But whoever stays behind will be in the blast zone. It's a suicide mission.
Humvee is heading out. Mechanized here. Yes, sir.
I've talked to the men, sir. We'll do it.
Are you sure, Bannon? I cannot order you to do this.
I understand, sir. We'll do it.
Captain, I'm scared.
Yeah. Me too, Thomas. We're doing the right thing. They'll remember us for this. Gunner! Target tank, 11 o'clock!
Identified!
Servo up!
Fire!
On the way!
Gunner, fire at will!
On the way!
Eagle 6! Eagle 6! This is Bannon. The Russians are renewing their attack, and they're coming at us with T-80s, BTRs, and BMPs. I also see infantry moving from house to house. This must be the big push. I've lost 2nd Platoon and most of 3rd Platoon as well. We're holding, but they're breaking through. I'll try to pull back a little and get them to follow, but we won't last much longer.
Understood, Captain. I appreciate what you're doing.
Sir, I just want to say I'm sorry.
No need, Captain. I'm humbled to have served with you.
Thank you, sir. Bannon out.
It's a good and satisfying end to Bannon's character arc, but I can't help but feel like I'm missing something. Bannon's final conversation with the Colonel makes it seem like he's atoning for some major mistake, but we still don't know the specifics. The level ends with the nuke touching down and wiping out Cascade Falls and everything inside it from the face of the earth. The game tells you you've won the battle, but you lost an entire company and you had to drop a nuclear weapon on your own territory. Is that really a victory? The next few missions are flashbacks. This is the part that I said breaks the flow of the story. We jump all the way back to the outbreak of the war in France and look at how Bannon and Parker started up. While I have no qualms with exploring how Parker, Bannon, and the Colonel got to where they were, I do take issue with the way the game does it. Throwing us into the middle of their story to start with, seeing through one of their character arcs finished, then looping us all the way back around to the beginning is a bit convoluted and forces us to readjust. While we do get a better appreciation of the characters after the flashbacks, I can't help but feel like the narrative would have flown better if it were told chronologically. Anyways, let's keep moving on from here. I'd rather not get bogged down on this detail. In the flashback missions, we see Bannon before he is humbled. He's brash, eager, confrontational, and makes mistakes. A lot of mistakes. Between failing to execute orders, getting an ally killed, and getting civilians killed, there's not exactly much to endear players to Bannon in this early stage. This is why I say the story would have been served better if it was told in chronological order. We went from Bannon being heroic and cancelling the apocalypse to him being an even worse dick than at the start of the campaign before getting humbled all over again. It effectively turns what should have been one long character arc into two. It's annoying. We flip back to the Soviet side of the story and it's revealed that some of the civilians that Bannon accidentally offed was Maloshenko's family.
Romanov must move immediately
Товарищ
to...
полковник,
What?
a message.
Now? Very well.
What is it, Uncle?
Kolya, it's your wife.
Masha?
She...
Что?
They're dead, Kolya. She and your daughter. Killed yesterday when the Americans raided Serebryansk. I'm so sorry.
Sorry. You're at war. They died for the state. They died for socialism. I'm proud.
You have my deepest
I
sympathy.
don't want sympathy. I want leaders with the courage to prevent NATO from walking into our soil.
Kolya, we're dealing with a strong adversary.
Then we must be stronger.
Tragic, if a bit abrupt, but also adequately explains why he's taking the war so personally. His reaction here does foreshadow why he's willing to take such severe actions later in the story. Additionally, the Soviet missions being few and far between means that the narrative flow isn't interrupted as badly as with the American side of things. Now that the flashbacks are done with, we finally rejoin Parker and Webb in the present. The mission continues directly after the nuke detonated and Cascade Falls. Everyone's gone and scattered about, and you have to rally the American forces back into fighting shape before the Soviet forces do. You start off acting as support for Webb's forces since you're the only one with a repair vehicle, but things soon devolve from there. The mission is easily the weakest in the entire campaign, though that's not to say it's a bad mission. The devs just stretched their gameplay system a bit too far here. Like too little butter spread across too much toast. Let me explain. World in Conflict was actually developed as a multiplayer game first, and then the campaign was built around the mechanics. In multiplayer, players have to choose between 4 different classes: infantry, armored, air, and support. Each class gives the player a different deck of units and support ability. You can see this in action during the campaign. There are missions where you're primarily supporting your allies, or other missions where you only have infantry. It keeps things manageable because that's how the game was designed. So now the game wants you to not only repair Webb's tanks, but also your own, and have your tanks engage the enemy, and manage artillery and air support too on top of that. It gets a bit overwhelming. I get that it fits with the mood that the campaign mission sets up, but that doesn't change the fact that it's the least enjoyable mission in the campaign. After this level, it's revealed that the Chinese have finally joined the war. On the side of the Soviets. I guess the Sino-Soviet split and the economic aid from America ended up being for nothing. But then again, when aren't commies stabbing their allies in the back? Now the Chinese are sending an armed force across the Pacific, and the US Pacific Fleet is either in shambles or tied up elsewhere. The situation is devolving drastically, and the US is left with 3 options. Not one is pleasing. 1 is they abandon the fight in Europe and defend the homeland. 2 is they have whatever forces left in the country try and stop the invasion. And 3 is they nuke Seattle right as the Chinese lands. The president orders all forces in and around Washington state to take back Seattle before the Chinese arrive, but he still has the nuke ready for launch in case of failure. So Parker and the Colonel and everyone else are in a mad dash for Seattle. Everyone's under immense pressure and they're starting to crack. Colonel Sawyer is getting madder by the hour, and it's easy to understand why. His battered force of nuke survivors are the closest one to the city and the only one that stands a chance at saving it before the nukes arrive. On the flip side with the Soviets, things are looking equally as grim. A lot of the Soviet invasion force got wiped out at Cascade Falls. Now they're all regrouping at Seattle to wait for Chinese reinforcements, but Colonel Orlovsky has a different plan. He's convinced that if the Soviets manage to hold off the Americans from retaking Seattle, and especially if the Chinese manage to land reinforcements, the Americans are just going to drop another nuke. He's not about to commit mass suicide and he couldn't care less what Moscow thinks. He's taking his men to an industrial harbor where an unmarked transport ship is waiting for their arrival. Predictably, this doesn't go well with Maloshenko at all. The captain is here to kill Americans, not run away from them. He wants to kill Americans so badly he's even willing to shoot his own allies that get in his way, which he does.
State. My wife and daughter didn't die so that you can turn tail and run.
But we don't belong here. This entire venture has been a fool.
What was that I said about commies stabbing their own guys in the back? Well, actually, let's be fair. Malyshenko did shoot the colonel in front, in cold blood, with the intention of doing the same to Major Lebedev had he not acquiesced, before storming off and taking the men under his command to Seattle. Anyway, so the final Soviet mission is just you and whatever's left of the colonel's force holding off a veritable tidal wave of American forces trying to catch you. They assume you're on your way to reinforce Seattle, even though you're not. You're still carrying out the colonel's plan, but it's not like you can just tell the Americans, so you hold out as long as physically possible until a wing of Soviet bombers arrive and flatten the American assault. After this is a short cutscene where Major Lebedev takes whatever is left of the force, sans Malyshenko and his company, home. And that's it. That's the Soviet storyline. A bit short due to Soviet assault's development getting cucked by the Activision purchase, but still pretty alright. All the missions after this are the American missions, and they're part of the base game. Back with Parker and company, they've arrived at the outskirts of Seattle, but are ordered to stand down and wait for reinforcements. Colonel Sawyer isn't happy about it but agrees once it's explained why. High Command wants a small force to deploy to a bunch of islands held by Soviets to take control of their anti-ship missile battery. It's supposed to be a way to slow down the Chinese invasion force and to buy more time for Seattle. The Colonel stays behind on the main line to organize the final assault, so it's all up to Parker and Webb. Once that's all done, it's now time for the final assault. Before you do that though, the good Reverend Powell here hypes you the hell up for the gauntlet you're going to run through.
I know that we're in a time of war. My brothers and my sisters, trouble don't last always. Over every mountain and through every valley, we shall prevail. Power to the faint and to those that have no might. Your strength shall be increased. We must never, never, never give up. You got to hold on till every battle has been fought and every victory has been won. We're going to shout hallelujah. 'Tis over and 'tis done. So no need to worry and no need to cry. I can see the dawning of a brand new day. You're gonna make it. You're gonna make it. We're gonna be victorious.
I hope the good Reverend's encouragement will be enough because it's all you're going to get. When the assault begins, Colonel Sawyer's force is the only one that breaks through the outer defense line, so it's up to you, Webb, and the Colonel to cut off the head of the snake. I earlier said that the mission is going to be a gauntlet, and I'm 100% serious. What's even more stressful is that you're playing on a timer. 45 minutes to be exact. Past that and the Air Force is nuking Seattle. Now, 45 minutes might seem like a lot of time, but this mission is an endurance run. You have limited resources and you're under attack by endlessly spawning Soviet troops. Even though your allies are tying down most of them, you're still wading waist deep through gunfire, artillery, and rockets. Not properly managing your forces could mean you'll be cutting it dangerously close. Once you've taken out the Soviet HQ, the Air Force moves in and sinks what's left of the Soviet Pacific Fleet moored on Seattle. So the battle is over, the nuke is averted, and the day is saved. Or so you thought. The Soviet force shows up from the backlines and is intent on wiping out Colonel Sawyer's now encircled troops. It's never explicitly said, but I like to think that this is Malyshenko's troops arriving late and trying to finish the job. It's a desperate fight. Webb got wounded in a cutscene, so it's literally just you holding the line against wave upon wave of Soviet forces. For a while, it even gets worse since you lose contact with the Air Force and can't call in reinforcements. Things are looking grim before the rest of the US forces finally arrive, just in the nick of time too. Now the encircler has become the encirclee. But unlike Caesar at Alesia, the Soviets didn't have the time to build 2 rings of wall to trap you and to hold off the enemy reinforcements. So they die. With the last major Soviet force taken out, the Chinese turned tail and abandoned their comrade. What was it I said about commies turning their backs on their friends? Whatever's left of the Soviets in continental America either get systematically hunted down or surrender. It's implied that the war continues, but this is where the game ends. It's a good game with a good story, and it even comes with a satisfying ending. We never get to know the story's continuation, and you know what? I'm fine with that. Considering that Ubisoft owns massive entertainment, a sequel will probably be generic, overlong, and riddled with microtransactions. I've made my peace with it. Everyone else should too. And we're finally rejoined by our spoiler-skipping friends. So, say I've managed to convince you to give the game a swing. Where would you get your hands on it? Well, the only place you can still get a digital copy is through GOG. Ubisoft pulled the game from Steam and Uplay when they shut down the multiplayer servers, hence the steep decline in popularity and relevance. It's $10 on GOG, and that gets you the complete edition, which includes the base game and Soviet Assault. There is a mod out there that re-enables multiplayer, but for some reason when I tried it out, Soviet Assault became inaccessible. So keep that in mind if you want to try out the multiplayer mode. Speaking of mods, there is also a modding scene for World in Conflict, but it's not the most active one. You might find some mods that you're interested in, but this isn't a Bethesda game. Mods aren't a selling point, and it isn't going to keep it relevant for a decade. So what's in the package is probably what you're getting. Overall, if you're into RTS games or even a newcomer to the genre, World in Conflict is a solid recommend. It's easy to pick up and learn, held up reasonably well, and the storyline will engage you from start to finish. It's a good game. Go get it. Channel update for my longtime subscribers. I'm basically done with college at this point and I'm job hunting, so commentary videos aren't exactly optimal for me to grow anymore. Commentary subjects tend to be time sensitive when it comes to relevancy, especially console wars commentary. Since I'm going to be busy working, it's going to be tough to keep up with all the fanboy bullshit. Because of this, I'm rolling back on console fanboy content and slowly shifting to game reviews. I'll still make the occasional commentary videos on topics I find interesting, but don't expect my usual weekly uploads for those. Anyways, I'm just about done with this video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share if you feel like it. This has been Cheems of Regret, reminding you all that you're nobody till somebody loves you. And that somebody is me. I love y'all. Signing out.